One of the wonderful remarks Nietzsche makes here is when he speaks of uh, the forgetfulness as making something into a cause sui. The forgetfulness he specifically speaks of in terms of uh, the most common form of stupidity, forgetting the purpose. So, for example, I've suspected, maybe unfairly in a way, but in any way, the thought occurred to me over the years watching Andrei Tarkovsky, who was the son of a poet, that he in some ways inherited the values of his father somewhat sleepily, as it were, and never raised them up to this scientific consciousness, as it were, never raised them up to really hold them in his hands and look at these values he inherited. He takes for granted a view of a kind of immortality. You die and there's immortality. This is, but of course, that's a Christian view in general, in some sense. But the way he his whole spirituality, although clearly it's sincerely felt, it has aspects that seem to have echoes of his father's poetry and his father's views. So what Nietzsche says is, in such a case, it's like a superstition. It becomes all the more powerful. It becomes the prejudice. This which amounts to just a prejudice because we haven't brought it to scientific critical attention. This becomes the spontaneous support of our whole being. And many such things exist in cultures in the past, and now in our own time they're more often uprooted and sifted through. And in fact, Jordan Peterson was mentioning this about marriage, for instance. So somebody challenges the institution of marriage, and then all of a sudden you have to come up with the whole argumentation to show that this is still valid, and you get involved in vigorous contestation over and sharp words over the things which one could have simply reclined in and treated as the cause sui and not asked about the why, would not bother to ask about the why. But surely, with respect to philosophers, we can expect that both Heidegger and Nietzsche have taken some concern with the why, and here the why is that history will serve life. Heidegger says here in this connection, he speaks the human being in its very essence characterized and distinguished by the historical. This is interpretation of what Nietzsche's saying, although it's close to Heidegger's own views. At the same time, the unhistorical has a primacy within human life. Within the human being, the characterization by means of the historical and the primary of this unhistorical belong together, are the same. In fact, there's another citation that I wanted to read more, if I can find it. So, in some ways, I see an overlapping of Heidegger's own views and Nietzsche's views. Certainly, there must have been. Obviously, Heidegger said that we cannot take Nietzsche seriously enough. Oh, okay. Here's what I wanted to read. Under the head historial, he says the human being, quote unquote, is this, not because it, quote unquote, has a quote unquote history. So it's like not because it has, in the terms of metaphysics, as present as what it can hold up to itself scientifically. It has a quote-unquote history that is, not because it can, I'm continuing to read from the citation, because it can calculate historical events and settle their accounts, but instead it, quote-unquote, has a history and a tradition because and insofar as temporality consists constitutes its essence. Human being is grounded in this temporality as the truth of being. He goes on, which at the same time is the ground of the possibility of history. So there's a looping around. There's this sort of Klein bottle or Mobius strip, which constitutes the very concept of Dawson, which he brings in all over the place within this, things that are oppositions within themselves. The more originarily this happens, the more historial the human being is, the less it needs historiology. So Heidegger, on the one hand, he says Nietzsche does not properly, quote unquote, properly distinguish between the historiology, the science of history, and history. On the other hand, in his interpretation, he, in a strong way, brings this in. This idea, some of Nietzsche's most greatest and, if I may say so, most amusing acerbities occur around the sciences, and it's of almost unparalleled importance in the modern scene in the terms of how clearly he puts the difficulty here, and Nietzsche does. So the natural result of it all is the favorite, quote-unquote, popularizing of science, or rather its feminizing and infantizing, the villainous habit of cutting the cloth of science to fit the figure of the quote-unquote general public. I think that's there's one more citation that will make this more clear, but I think already this idea of cutting the cloth of the science to fit the general public. In other words, the scientist isn't following the highest aspirations of his science, but rather he's trying to be quote unquote useful to the public. He's like a almost like a politician that has to pay out the public in terms of quote unquote usefulness. This is there's a problem with this from the vulgarity of uselessness in the terms of. But let's contrast it. This is complicated. I can't say everything at once. Let's go on with the rest of the quote. He says, this is a little later in the passage. He speaks of, and its needs are theirs. Oh wait, let me start to say. They are speaking of the scientists or savants, as he sometimes calls them. The name scientist is relatively recent coinage. They are part of the general, quote unquote, general public themselves, and its needs are theirs. They only require to take themselves less seriously to be able to open their little kingdom successfully to popular curiosity. This easygoing behavior is called, quote unquote, the modest condescension of the savant to the people, whereas in reality he has only descended to himself, so far as he is not a savant but a plebeian. So, I mean, in other words, it's as though Socrates, who had some great wisdom, has gone to the marketplace with the politicians and the sophists, and or to use his own metaphor, let's see his own metaphor. He's gone to give candy to the children as they wanted instead of the medicine, which is his own metaphor for himself. That he will give cauterize people or do what painful, give them this pain that comes from the being stung with the realization that they don't know what they think they know, and then they have to be shaken out of their opinions and try to ascend to truth. But instead, he's going to give them exactly what they want. So this is the image of current science, exactly what we want. This is greatly complicated by the view that if you look at the presentations of people like Steven Pinker and so on, and then you ask, is there actual improvement in life, then that becomes a complicated question. And then on the simple, and if you think more from I want to go more in from how this would look to Strauss in terms of Strauss's citizens' understanding in terms of, Strauss quotes sometimes Auguste Comte, COMTE, to speak of the crude but judicious understanding of common sense. So from that point of view, you can speak in the terms Lenin used to sell communism. Electrification. This is obvious. So okay, electricity is good. Some forms of the European science-produced technology that are good. Maybe those weren't produced specifically from the universities, but from inventors here and there. But in any case, you can see that it becomes complicated simply to say this selling of the candy is all bad. It comes into the whole problem of progress and so on. Okay, we can't say everything at once, but let's try to go on with the thought on the next